also wanted to start with what this isn't. I was not planning to do any kind of sort of technical electronics training here. So the assumption is that you know how to use Google Earth, you know how to use your flight instruments, you know how to enter waypoints, how to do all that kind of stuff. If those things are challenging or you're having problems, you can reach out to me or to Gavin, and between the two of us or anybody else who is involved in this race, we can get you straightened out. This is not intended to be sort of a list of topics that we go through. I really put it together as I was thinking through all the things that would be helpful for somebody to do who's never done a hike and fly race. That's what this is. It's almost like a checklist. And so it's organized into first a few tools to understand the task that that is going to be given out on any given day. And then some of the things you can do now to make sure you're prepared. And this isn't physical training or flight training. This is like strategy training. And then things to do once the task is actually announced. And then a couple of other topics that are worth just sort of being aware of. And my I guess the topics that I want to go through are sort of related to each one of those categories. But this is more what we're going to go through. So first we're going to talk about the tools. Then we're going to orient you all to the Monroe area and talk about how you can become more oriented as you prepare for the race in September. And then we're actually going to go through the process of developing a strategy for doing a hike and fly task. And we'll go through that in some amount of detail. So that's probably where we'll spend the majority of our time. If we have time, I'm going to go through a few things that I've learned in the competitions that I've done. And Gavin, you could probably write books about this. So maybe I'll share a couple of things again if we have time, and Gavin can probably add to that with great depth. And then again, if we have time, we'll go through some discussions on how these tasks are created and some of the philosophies behind the tasks. And then Q&A, if we need to at the end, we can do that, but hopefully that's more sort of happening throughout. Okay. Any questions on any of these tools, I guess, just to get started? Maybe that's sort of a dumb question or too open-ended. Google Earth, I think, is probably one of the most, when you're preparing for a hike and flight task, I think Google Earth is one of the most valuable tools. It's something that's used, from my understanding, pretty much by every serious hike and fly athlete in great length and detail in preparing for and understanding a task, preparing for it, and ultimately developing a strategy to execute that task. So that's one we're going to use a lot tonight. Obviously, that's something you're using before the task, not using during the task typically. There's another one that maybe some of you are familiar with. It's called hikeandfly.org. It's a very simple website. It's basically a topographical map plus glide slope calculator. So we'll use that tonight as well. For navigation during a competition, as well as preparation the night before, Gaia is an invaluable tool. That's what I use. I've heard that there's others. FatMap is another one that I've heard a lot of people use. Nevertheless, you absolutely need a really good GPS mapping system on your phone with downloadable maps that you can use to navigate, especially when you're on the ground. When I'm flying, I'm using Fly Sky High because I'm an Apple guy. But of course, everybody really likes XRedRocks for Android as well. So the two on the left are, of course, you use those before the task and preparing for the task. And then the two on the right are used to some extent in preparation for the task, but extensively during the task. Any questions on that topic? That one's pretty straightforward. All right, orientation to the area. How many people have been to Monroe before? I'm seeing at least two, and then a couple thumbs up from the people who don't have video on. Okay, so maybe 2 or 3 have been to Monroe. This is just a Google Maps version of it. A couple things to point out, Monroe Comp HQ, this is sort of the main LZ, and where where we meet every morning is right here. These are some of the primary official launches. We'll go through those in a little bit more detail when we get into Google Earth later. There's basically 4 main valley systems. There's the Monroe Valley, which is really long and stretches all the way up north. It goes off the screen, frankly, and is one of the main thoroughfares. There's a fairly large highway that goes up the middle of it. There's a really interesting thing to be aware of. This just south of Monroe is a little bit of a choke point in the valley, where there's some mountains actually that bridge between the range to the west and the range to the east. Then there's a small valley just south of that, another valley beyond that with another choke point right in here. And then there's the Kusharm Valley, which is to the east. And I put the end here, but it actually kind of runs all the way down and ultimately sort of intersects with the Panguitch Valley. And then this is probably a little bit less relevant for any of you who are in the challenge category, but there's a giant desert, Red Rock Desert, that's pretty remote to the east of the main sort of competition area. And we've only had we've only had 1 task that's actually gone out into the desert, and it was task 1 from last year, and it was fantastic. But there are multiple tasks that are designed to push the field out into that desert. We've just never had the conditions to do it, except for, again, on task 1 last year. So that's sort of an overview of the area. For those who haven't been there, I thought it would be helpful to just get a sense of scale. So these are some of the photos that I've taken. This is basically partway up on the mountain, looking out over the Monroe Valley. And maps can be deceiving, obviously. If you remember back to the long red strip that I said was the Monroe Valley, it looks fairly narrow. It looks like a valley that would be pretty easy to fly across. But the reality is it's pretty big. I think it's almost, what, Gavin, probably 15 miles wide at this point.
Yeah.
So you can fly across it, but it's not simple, and you need a lot of elevation to do it, or you need thermals in the valley. Here's another one. This is from a little higher on the mountain, looking at the same valley from the same direction, but looking out toward the town of Monroe. I put this one in there because this was from one of the tasks, I think in 2021, where I ended up landing out and having to run a really long ways. I think I ran 9 or 10 miles to get to goal on a dirt road, sort of like this one that day. And then this is the Mount Etna launch, which sits almost 12,000 feet above sea level. And
I think it's actually, over.
Yeah, maybe even higher. But it just gives you sort of a sense for how big the terrain down there is. It's tall and the valleys are wide. The thermals are big. It's a fantastic place to fly. But everything's big. Like hiking up to here is a really long, it's a long haul. So anyway. So that gives you sort of a little bit of a sense of what the place is like. I thought at this point it would make sense to dive into Google Earth. So let me open that. Okay. So as you can see, if you followed the instructions that were sent out beforehand and you open Google Earth, it should look a lot like this. All of the waypoints that are pre-established are sprinkled over the landscape. Here's Monroe, of course, in the center of the screen. And I thought it would make sense just again, for orientation for anybody who hasn't been there before, just to identify some of those launches and valley systems that we talked about on the map previously. So directly above Monroe, I think it's probably 3,000 vertical feet is the Cove launch, which is known as T02 here. And then Monroe Peak, which you can drive to this. Monroe Peak is right here. And it is, Gavin, you're gonna have to help me. Actually, no, Google Maps will tell me. 11,179 feet above sea level. And then the town of Monroe is 5,400. So it's a huge hike to get from Monroe up to Monroe Peak. Some of the other spots we talked about, Mount Edna, which is down here, T06. And we can get elevation here as well. 11,6. So again, super tall. And then I'm going to zoom way out here, try and keep orientation north to north. Okay. So again, this is the Monroe Valley up here, running sort of roughly northeast and southwest, with Monroe down toward the southern end of it. Then we have, I guess maybe it would be called the Junction or the Marysville Valley runs here. And then the Panguitch Valley is down here. And then obviously off to this side is that really long Kusharm Valley that I talked about previously. It's sort of interesting. You zoom in and this ridge line here, like the valley floor up to here looks pretty small, especially in comparison with all the other mountains. But it's actually really tall. We ran a task in 2022, where we basically flew all the way down, or a lot of us walked all the way down this ridge and then back. But it is, again, just to put it in perspective, at the base, it's 7,600, and at the top, 8,600. So, you know, over about 1,000 vertical feet. That's the general lay of the land. But one of the thoughts that I had is it'd be nice, you know, one of the challenges that everybody always faces the first time they enter one of these competitions is because we always run some task where you'll be launching from Cove, and we would typically start that task down in Monroe. So for anybody who hasn't done this before or hasn't used Google Earth extensively, you would basically use Google Earth to plot your route from Monroe up to Cove. And you'd just be looking at it, trying to spot what looks like the most obvious path. And I would start, typically the way that I would start is I would start here and then I'd move to Gaia. I'm gonna show you that a little bit later when we actually create a strategy for one of these tasks. But to start, you know, you're just looking for any kind of path or road or I guess path of least resistance. There's a couple of ways to attack this. This canyon, what's it called? I can't remember. Anyway, the rodeo grounds is right here, and this is the most direct route, but it's also one of the steepest. Sand Canyon is over here, and a lot of people take that because it's a little bit less steep. And those two paths merge partway up. But then the most brutal part of this is you work your way ultimately up this canyon. You can see there's a little bit of a path in the bottom of the canyon. And then you go pretty much off-road up this ridge line, up through here, and maybe this looks small, but this is a haul. I've never heard anybody get to Cove and be like, yeah, that wasn't so hard. Then you get into this terrace section, and if you're really sneaky like Revis, you might launch from here. But just when you think you're done, you have this brutally steep head wall to get all the way up to launch. And this is really, really long, and it's loose, and every step, it's like one step forward and two steps back. There's really no easy way to do it. A lot of people, when they get to this point, will actually follow this road around and then come up this ridge, which is a lot less steep. So I'm showing you this not really for you to memorize how to get to Cove, but just because this is exactly how you use Google Earth to create strategies. Is you're looking for the best path, you're looking for what's going to be the most efficient, and then what I would typically do is I'd take this over into Gaia. I'd memorize what's here. I'd have two screens open, looking at what's on Google Earth, map that over to Gaia, and then I'll actually sometimes drop in, if there's not an obvious trail and it's going to be cross-country walking, I'll actually drop in a couple of waypoints in Gaia and use those when I'm hiking to ensure that I'm on the path that I intended. I'll pause there for just a minute. Does anybody have any questions? Again, this stuff is somewhat straightforward if you've done it before, but if you've never done it before, if you've never sort of planned a route to the backcountry using a mapping system and Google Earth, then maybe some of this stuff is not obvious or clear.
For navigating off trail and off roads, is there a database available of like public land versus private land?
So interestingly, in Utah, it's almost all federally managed public land, either BLM or National Forest Service. There's a very small number of well, let me be really clear. If you're in a valley with farms, then clearly that's private and probably best avoided. If it's not a farm, if it's just sagebrush as far as you can see, or if you're in the mountains, it's almost certainly public. And not only public, but federally managed public land, which matters because the way the Forest Service and the BLM manage their land is it's accessible to anybody. So you're pretty much good to go. Trying to think of exceptions. There's some national parks that we can't land in or launch from, but we've been pretty careful to design the tasks not to ever put anybody at risk of making that mistake. So other than that, I think you're pretty much good to go. Gavin, anything else you want to add there?
No, I would say more to the previous point of just using these tools. I have used them a ton, and you can tend to go, yeah, I know how to do that. And in my experience, it's not like riding a bike. These are things that need to be reviewed and done a lot before the actual race. If you're trying to do this on the fly, what Ben just did there looks straightforward and easy. But suddenly when you're tired and it's day 2 or 3 of the race and you haven't had much sleep and your feet hurt, trying to figure it out is tough. So just what you can do between now and then is even if it's just, it's a hike behind your house that you do every day, start using these tools to do everything. Every time you go outside to do a hike and fly or a hike or go out with your kids and do something, just use this stuff. And so it becomes second nature because your mind doesn't work as well when you're at 12,000 feet, day 3 of a race.
Yeah, that's totally true. For any of you who are coming from sea level like I am, the elevation is something to consider, both mentally and physically. It takes a serious toll. For the past 2 years, I've gone to Utah about a week and a half before the race and worked remote from there just to help acclimatize a little bit, and it's made a big difference.
Yeah.
Just one more example of using Google Earth to sort of give yourself every possible advantage. This mountain range, there we go. So we've used this P30 a couple of times for a couple of different tasks. And climbing up this face to get there is not particularly straightforward. And if you mess it up, you can end up with doing a lot of bushwhacking. And so one of the things that I've done and is that look at the brush that you see in here. And you can see that this ridgeline over here has much heavier brush than this ridgeline here. And then you can see what's probably a fairly natural entry point somewhere along this road where you can, again, avoid too much brush. So when the first time we did this, I actually came and looked at Google Earth just like I'm doing now. And I said, okay, this is the ridgeline that I want to go up. And then I want to make sure to hit this part of the ridge line so that I can avoid all this brush here and instead go up right through this relatively light brush zone. And so what I did is I actually put a GPS waypoint into Gaia right here so that I knew what to aim for. And then I knew that I had to hit this road, get to the point where I was straight downhill from that GPS waypoint and then just work my way straight up toward it. And it worked perfectly. The people who followed this ridge ended up doing a lot of bushwhacking. And the people who ended up falling off the right side, sort of in this direction, also ended up doing a lot of bushwhacking. So there's a few tricks like that that I think work really well and make a big difference when, again, as Gavin said, when you're exhausted and having a hard time thinking straight. If you're trying to remember what you saw on Google Earth last night, it's likely not going to play out so well.
A little trick that I learned being so bullheaded in pretty much all of my X-House campaigns was, if you're going the wrong way, don't force it. Stop, turn around, get back to the right place and go from there. This is a mistake that the best of the best make. You just feel like you should just keep forging along and stick with the shortcut. The bush in Utah is no joke. And I went and got Bill Belcourt out of the bush last year during the wide open. And, we got back to the truck at 5 o'clock in the morning. And he and I were both razor bladed. We were both bleeding pretty good. And his clothes looked like he was a homeless person. So it's no joke. And you really do have to, you will radically reduce your stress level and time by spending more time just looking at the map, taking your time, figuring it out. Don't rush. There are times when moving slow is fast.
Yeah, totally makes sense. All right, any questions up until now? So the next thing I thought we would do is actually go through the process of developing a task strategy. And two things on this topic. The first is, clearly you're going to be doing this the night before, or maybe even a couple days before. Basically, as soon as the task is called, you want to start taking a look at it, start thinking about it, start organizing how you're going to approach it. But if you wait to try and develop a task strategy until, and the first time you've ever done it is like the night before the race starts, you're probably not going to develop a great strategy and it's probably going to be stressful. So my recommendation would be, there's a bunch of tasks already posted on the XRedRocks website. You can go pull any of those and develop some strategies just to practice using these tools, as Gavin pointed out. We have not yet posted the challenge tasks, but I'll share a few of those later. And you can certainly go and put those into your instrument and again, do the same thing. Start developing some strategies around some of these tasks. I don't think it would make sense, even once all the tasks are posted, to go and develop all of the strategy for every one of those tasks for a couple of reasons. One is we modify tasks frequently, up to just I guess the night before the task actually begins. The other thing is, obviously, you don't have the weather forecasting for the day that the task will be run. So you run the risk of wasting a lot of time if you develop a ton of strategies just so you're ready to go. But to do a few, again, just for practice, I think would be really, it would be time well spent. So to walk you through the process that I go through once I have a task and I'm starting to think about how I'm going to go through that task, it's basically, this is probably pretty obvious. Steps 1 through 4 aren't necessarily always going to be in order. And sometimes you're going to use all of these tools sort of in parallel with one another to develop your strategy. But these are basically the tools that are going to be used and sort of the order that you go in. So I thought that for practice, we could take, this is not a task any of you have seen because we haven't posted it yet, but this is one of the challenge tasks that's been created. And so we'll go through this particular task. think about how we might devise a strategy for it and use all the tools to do so. All right, so first of all, we're going to build the task in Google Earth. And again, this isn't intended to be a lesson on how to use Google Earth. But if anybody has questions as I go through this process, feel free to let me know. So what I do is, first of all, you should have all of the waypoints downloaded. And they can be a little bit distracting if they're all up at the same time. So I actually turn them all off. And then I go through and just turn on the ones that are going to be used for this particular task. So in this case, it's these ones that are listed here. I'm going to go in alphabetical order, which means I'm not turning them on in the order that they're listed, just so I don't have to scroll back and forth.
Oh, there on the website too, if you haven't already seen this, but I'm assuming you have because you've all downloaded them. These letters mean something. The Revis created all these waypoints with Ben's help and a bunch of other people too, but a few years back, and we keep adding more, but all the letters are significant. So it's worth just taking a look at that key on the website at the bottom of the rules page with all the waypoints, so you can kind of get familiar with the difference between T and P and X and all these kind of things.
Yeah, good point, Gavin. Okay, so these are our waypoints. And if they're less than, I don't know, a few hundred meters, I don't really bother putting in the circle to show how big it is, because it's just not that big relative to the rest of the task. But if there's anything big like this one, it's a 5K turn point, 5K radius, then I'll go ahead and put those in. If I can get the toolbar to come up. Oh, that's weird. No, it's already on circle, which is convenient, but I don't see where, anyway. Oh, I bet the toolbar is underneath all of your faces. Hold on a second. Yes, it is. Okay. So 5K, close enough. Oops. And I'm gonna hit save. Okay, so our task basically starts at X5, goes to T6, P33, L11, and then A3. So it's X5, T6, P33, L11, which has this huge radius, and then down to A3. One other thing that's important to note, you have to tag this L11. You have to tag that on the ground. All the rest can be tagged on the ground or in the air. So the first thing I'm going to do is just try and understand it sort of at the most basic level. So I'm going to zoom in here and understand what's up high in the mountains, what's down low. And typically we start down low. There are some exceptions, but typically we'll start down low and start with a hike because we're starting in the morning, the day isn't really on. So we're starting at X5 down here called Bullion Falls, hiking up to Mount Edna Peak. We can check elevations very easily. This is about 7,800 feet in elevation, and we saw Edna Peak a while ago was like 11,600, right? Yeah, 11,600. So a huge hike, a huge hike to start. There's a pretty obvious road here. And then immediately I'm going to start looking at things like, oh, okay, so clearly people are shortcutting some of these switchbacks. And again, just like I said before, I might even drop Gaia waypoints in to identify where some of these are. This one looks like it saves a little bit off of this corner. This one saves a little bit, and this one here as well. This one looks like it saves a lot, right? And there's a bit of a clear path here that you can definitely go through. This one looks like it probably doesn't save much of anything, although maybe a little bit of time saved there. And then it's just cruising up the road, maybe some opportunities, to cut this one here. And then this one is sort of interesting. You can see the main road comes all the way out here to this big switchback out here and then back and then up. There's some roads something going around on this side of the mountain. Anyway, I'm gonna pick what I think is the most logical path. And so this one looks like it's probably the quickest. This one looks like it's more of a major road for trucks and is going to be at a much lower angle. So, this is probably the one that I'd plan to take. And again, I'd maybe drop a little GPS waypoint here just to remind me that this is the place to go to the right. I'll point one thing out that I learned very quickly from Revis. Revis was really good at hiking up the roads, and I always thought I could make some shortcut and go through the bushes and, and beat him up something. And he was always, when we were walking together, we were roughly the same speed in that first year. And he never took the shortcut and I always did, and he was always beating me whenever I took the shortcut. So those shortcuts sometimes just aren't as fast as staying on the road. Okay, so that's going to be obviously a hike. There's really no way to fly from X5 to T6, especially in the morning. And then we can see we're going to have to fly out to P33. So I think at this point, it's just to understand that this is much lower elevation. We can take a quick look. This is at 8,500. This is at 11.5. So quite a bit of vertical drop from there to here. And then you got to get from P33 over to this giant circle, tag that on the ground, and then get to A3. So one of the things that we always want to make sure these tasks do is that they force some decisions. And one of the decisions here, the first obvious decision, is once you're at T6, do you wait for the day to turn on a little bit, or do you just go for it? And I think there's maybe a variety of ways to answer that question. One of the things we'll want to do is look at hikeandfly.org to look at glide ratios, see if we can get P33 in the air if there's no thermic activity. And then if you do just do this gliding and you're able to tag P33 in the air and there's no thermic activity, then where do you ultimately end up landing and how far of a run is it going to be to get into the L11 turn point and then get down to A3? So if the day is on, of course, you can launch T6, tag P33 in the air, fly over here and tag this on the ground as close as possible to A3, pack up and run in. But you could also tag this turn point up on one of these peaks somewhere, right? You could top land somewhere up in here. This looks pretty shallow, not too much brush, and has plenty of vertical to glide down to A3. So maybe that would be the strategy, right? Try and top land somewhere on this big broad ridge and then relaunch to fly all the way into goal. So a few decisions that need to get made. So then the next step is, now that we sort of understand roughly what our task is, let's go and take a look at the weather forecast. And I already cheated. I looked at the weather forecast for the next few days. I'm an XC Skies guy. We would never call this task on Friday or Saturday, but if the conditions were the same as they were today in Monroe, then this is the type of task that we would probably call. Let's see if I can find Mount Etna here. Okay. So we're going to look at 12,000-foot winds to understand what it's doing up on the tall peaks. And at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, it's blowing almost straight west at like 6. If we start the task at 8, maybe we could be on top by 11. A little more wind, but more southwest at this point. Oh, sorry, I switched to Friday, my bad. Okay, this makes more sense. Less lift and the similar amount of wind, although it's a little bit more, there's a little bit more of a southerly aspect to it. So anyway, we're just getting a sense of like what time does the day turn on, how strong are the winds at different elevations. You know, we can look at surface and see what the valley wind is doing. Valley wind would be a tailwind that would be helping us. So anyway, this is just like typical flight forecasting, trying to develop a strategy for a rent that is appropriate for the weather for the day. Certainly by you know, by noon, so this is lift above ground, certainly by noon, the day is on, right? So, and maybe you could even find reasonable lift as early as 11. So anyway, if we had called this task for today, and this was the weather forecast, this looks like it, you know, this starts to give you a sense of what you'd be dealing with at different elevations and different times of day, of course. So now we have a sense for the weather. Oh, I can find out. That's what I'm going to pull up next. So if you've never used this website, it's a great tool. It's a little bit glitchy. I will, assuming I'm flying in zero wind or downwind, I will typically just move this to a glide ratio of 10. And unfortunately, we are not in Switzerland. Navigate over to where we will be. Okay, so here is the Monroe Valley. Monroe is about here. So Mount Etna should be right here. Waiting for it to load. Let's see. Right here is launch, right in between these two little peaks. So all you do is you click, after you've adjusted the glide ratio, you click where you're going to launch from. And then it calculates where you can glide to, assuming a 10-to-1 glide ratio. Okay, so if you recall, the first turn point after launching, actually, I don't remember which one that is exactly. It's P33, but where is that in the topology? Okay, so here's Edna, T06. That's where we're launching from. There's this big canyon here. So it's just south of that big canyon on this shoulder that sticks out into the valley just a little bit. So now we go back here. Here's the canyon. This is that shoulder, right? So the glide calculator is saying that as long as we can get a 10-to-1 glide, we can tag that turn point without even catching a thermal. And then interestingly, Mount Etna is huge, as you can tell. It looks like you can tag that, and then you can, again, assuming a 10-to-1 glide, you can even land up on that shoulder. Oh, no, I was wrong. I'm looking at the wrong spot. Sorry. This site is a little slow at times. So I can land on this road, probably, again, let's look back at Google Earth. So it looks like you can actually land inside the cylinder with a single glide off of the top of Mount Etna. Again, assuming a 10-to-1 glide. And then, so you could theoretically land here, hike up here, and then fly down, or land here, pack up and run down. Or if you got any lift at all, again, you could probably land up on the shoulder and then easily fly right down into goal. So that's essentially it. On this task, I'm not even sure I would use Gaia. I'd certainly use Gaia when I'm running the task to navigate when I'm on the ground, but I don't think we need to calculate any, running distances or anything else. It's a relatively straightforward hike up to the top, and then launching on the assumption that you can tag most of the turn points with a single glide. Does that make sense? Now, to be honest, if we had the forecast that was the forecast today, I don't think we would run this task because it would be too easy. I think we'd probably extend it. At the very least, we'd probably shrink the size of that 5K cylinder and force people to run up into here. This is the junction launch right here. So maybe we would put a really small cylinder right here, and you have to run all the way up to junction launch junction, and fly back down to the town of Junction. Anyway, we'd make the task a little more challenging if we had a forecast as good as the forecast in Monroe was today. But that gives you a sense of how we approach this, the strategy of any given task. I'll pause there. Does that make sense generally? Any concerns or questions about it? Gavin, anything you want to add?
No, it reminds me of the first year we went up to Edna, right? Was that day
Day 2.
2? Yeah. And that was really interesting for me, meet directing, because I was thinking about it, of course, from the hike and fly mindset. And the pros all had a big day where they flew off Edna. They had to land down by Junction and then relaunch and keep going. And the adventure task ended. We didn't have challenge back then. The adventure task ended in Junction, so it wasn't too dissimilar from the one that Ben just showed you. And it was driving me personally crazy that people weren't launching up there. That they, once they got up, they waited and waited and waited and waited for it to kind of turn on. And it was that they had missed what Ben had just gone through. They didn't need for it to be on. They were on a huge mountain. They could glide down. They had a tougher glide than what he just showed you, but it turned into this crazy fun, wicked to watch running race into Junction, because the pilots who did finally go all landed within, a few hundred meters of one another. They packed up really quick and ran in. So it was a great race. It was absolutely fantastic. But had they done a little bit more prep that Ben just took you through, it would have gone to whoever got up to the top of Edna the fastest, because you would have gotten up there, launched immediately, and done the task. So this kind of prep and this kind of, thinking through all the various options, including how good am I at top landing? Where could I potentially stick it in? Because this is 10-1. If you get just a little bit of buoyant air, it completely changes things. And so my philosophy that I learned from Kriegel is you always take sportive risk if it's safe. You always be optimistic, kind of hope for the best. And you don't want to give away 5,000 feet of vertical gain either. So you're always weighing, what's the possible gain versus what's the possible loss here. And doing the more of this kind of thing that Ben's walking you through here really helps you understand that.
Any questions or concerns thus far?
Another question. What sort of lead time do we have from when the task will be officially announced to having to go run it? Is this like we have 12 hours, we have 2 hours, 24?
Yeah, great question.
Yeah, that is a good question. We try, assuming the forecast is reasonable and the weather's going to be good and we have reasonable confidence in it. Our goal has always been to call all of the tasks the night before the first task begins. And we still haven't done that. So what we've basically committed to is that we will host the task sometime in the PM, or better said, sometime the night before the task actually begins. Part of the challenge is that the task committee is all in the race. And so sometimes we don't get back until a bit later, just like all of you. And so we need to get back and then huddle together to quickly figure out what the task for the next day is going to be and then get it posted. So that's why sometimes it's a little bit later, but we basically get it out at least the night before, but as soon as possible, basically. Any other questions?
What are the logistics of getting to the start of the task? Like I'm assuming we're dropped off, but when the task is announced, there's like a time to meet and that kind of stuff?
Yeah, Gavin, do you want to cover that one?
Yeah, I had a real light copy. I barely heard that, but basically, unless weather forces something different, in other words, a shuttle to start over at Edna or Junction, basically the start every day is at 8. And so when we announce the task the night before, we cover some of these logistics. If it's the Monroe LZ, which it often is, it'll just be 7:45 at the LZ, and we hand out the trackers. I give a quick briefing on the weather while Revis does, and then boom, you're off as close to 8 as we can. We do not supply transport to, I think that was one of your questions. We don't supply transport to the Monroe LZ necessarily, unless that's been kind of pre-arranged, but we provide retrieve at the end of the day, no matter where you are. But Monroe LZ, you got to get there on your own. But, or we meet there if we're using another, if we're using another place, and then we transport everybody. And again, I didn't really hear you, so did that answer the question?
Yeah, it did.
Okay, cool.
So in other words, we all meet at the Monroe LZ every day, typically around 7:30, 7:45. You'll already know the task. We hand out trackers, and then if the start of the race is somewhere else, then the same vehicles that will retrieve you at the end of the day will help us all get to wherever that task is starting.
And then those tasks obviously would then start later, then we basically call it out there. There just has to be a little bit of cushion for our scorekeeper to know. So we'll get in position, and then I can be in contact with him, and okay, we're going to do start at 9, 9:30, whatever, whenever we're ready.
Yeah.
We try to start every day at 8.
All right. We're at an hour. If people want to go a little longer, I can go for probably another 15 or 20 minutes. There were a couple of other things that I was going to go through if it's helpful, but if you guys would prefer to sign off and get back to your evening, that's totally fine as well. The things that I thought we could go through, I was going to share a couple of lessons learned from 2 of the tasks where I made some mistakes that I thought would be worth sharing. And then if helpful, I was going to share just a few of the general principles that we use around task design. How about this? I'll start going through it. If you guys need to go, totally fine, just hang up. And then for anybody who sticks around, we can continue to go through it. Okay, so a couple of things that I have learned. Let me open Google Earth here again. So in 2021, task 3. Give me 1 second to get Google Earth showing what I wanted to show here. Google Earth seems not to be responding. Can I not scroll or click? All right. Okay, I'm gonna show my track log for the third task in 2021. And I'm not showing the entirety of the task, but the short version is we hiked up to Monroe Peak from what's called Monroe Mid. So it wasn't a full hike. And then you basically had to fly out to this ring, to this giant cylinder. And then you had to fly back to Monroe Peak, topland, this is the pro task, relaunch, fly out and tag it again, and then fly, I think it was back to Monroe to finish the task. Yeah, it was, and then finish back in Monroe. So it's basically kind of a zigzag, including a top landing on Monroe Peak, and then fly back to this town of Monroe. So hiked up to Monroe, launched, messed around trying to get high for a while because I knew that I had to fly all the way out into the valley and then make it back and be high enough to get to Monroe Peak again. So screwed around trying to find thermals anywhere that I could, didn't work out to the south. So I came back to the main peak, finally got high enough that I thought, okay, it's time to go. So I was on glide with two other people, and we were flying out here, and they were getting a better glide than I was. I was getting nervous that I wasn't going to be able to tag the cylinder with enough elevation to get back. And so from up in the air, I saw that there was a bunch of terrain over here, and there was also a big sort of mesa that was just black rock. And I was like, okay, that looks like a really obvious trigger. I'm gonna go over and try and get up again, and then continue my way towards the cylinder. Clearly, it didn't work. So I ended up actually top landing right here. This is a what's called Poverty. This is an official launch called Poverty. I walked up this little road a little ways, relaunched, scratched around for what felt like an eternity, started to get up, tried to bench back, and ultimately sank out and landed in this weird little spot back in here. And then you can't see it because it's sort of underground, but I hiked out, I launched again, continued to struggle, ended up landing up here, and finally just gave up. And I'm like, okay, I'm just going to run. And so my track, you can barely see it. It's partially underground because the altitude wasn't perfectly accurate. But I ran out to here, got up on this different peak, launched again, flew down and tagged the turn point and sank out. And then I was like, fine, the day's almost done. So actually, this is where I sank out. So I started running up this road and then ran out of time. So I did horribly because everybody else was smart enough not to be heading for the cylinder and then to turn away from the cylinder to try and go get elevation. Everybody else was smart enough to actually fly out and tag it. And some people found thermals out here, some people didn't. The people who didn't tagged it and flew partway back and then started hiking up to Monroe again, and then ultimately ran out of time somewhere up in here, but definitely did far better than I did. And so one of the things that I've learned, I'm going to go back to the slides here. Stay close to, like if you don't know what to do, don't do something stupid and just like leave the course line and go like off on some wild adventure for no apparent reason. If there's something really obvious, like a giant cloud, and you can just go get under it and get up again, sure. But not for anything that's just like some terrain that looks maybe slightly promising. Also, when a flight doesn't go as well as it should and you end up on the ground, don't underestimate the power of walking. Let's see here, there's a task last year where it was really windy. And so a lot of people chose to walk. Just like literally from the start, they just started walking down the valley to the next turn point. Other people like me went up on the mountain to launch. All of that time going up the mountain to launch and ultimately flying helped us zero. All the people who just walked beat us. anyway, the point here is if you're walking on something fairly close to course line, you can actually cover an enormous amount of distance in a day. And so while flying is always going to be more efficient, screwing around sort of incessantly trying to get back in the air when getting back into the air is not particularly promising because the conditions are just not that good, often you're going to be far more efficient just walking. So that was one of the things, like stay close to course line. Don't underestimate the power of walking to cover distance. Any questions on that one? I applied that lesson to great effect in the following 2 years, and it made a huge difference for me. Let's see. Let me turn this task off and turn this other one on.
We kind of have on that note, it's not as relevant here in this arena, but I learned this from Hansa many years ago that if you, which I think he actually did really well on this task that Ben was talking about. If in general, when you're contemplating walking or flying, your odds go up a lot if you don't have a headwind and your terrain is dropping. If you have a headwind and your terrain is going up, if you don't get a thermal, your flying option is not very good. It's better to just walk it out. Again, that's a lot of things. We're shelving a lot of things here, so that's not an absolute, but in general, especially just little hops, little 5K, 10K hops, which can make a huge difference, especially if you're flying, but they can not be very efficient if the terrain's going up and you're going against a headwind. You're definitely going to be faster on foot.
I'm a super nerd. I'm an engineer, so prior to the first race, I actually built a spreadsheet that calculated how much headwind would, how do I put this? Basically, if you assume a 10-to-1 glide ratio and you have a really easy hike up, meaning not a lot of switchbacks, not a lot of bushwhacking, nothing that makes it inefficient. So then assuming that the hike up is perpendicular to course line, meaning it's not taking you backwards, but it's also not taking you forwards, then how much headwind would be the break-even point where walking would expend the same amount of energy as hiking up and flying? And the answer is basically zero. It's very similar efficiency if there is zero headwind to walk on the flat or to hike up perpendicular and fly. So if there's any headwind at all, you basically want to just walk. The exception, of course, is if there's thermals. If there's thermals, then of course flying is far better. But just walking on the flat is definitely something that can get you a lot of distance along course line. All right, so this track log is just a little bit confusing because this one came from the trackers, which means it turns on at the beginning of the day and it turns off at the end of the day, irrespective of whether it's in a car or with a competitor. So it has this sort of strange loop. But the task this day started in Monroe, and then it was this path here, and then headed back all the way up to Emory. So this was task 1 in 2023. So the part that we're going to focus on is this very first part. I actually, like, this was one of my favorite tasks of all time. Super fun, and I did reasonably well. But I made one massive mistake. So this is what we were looking at before. It's the hike from Monroe up to the Cove launch, which is directly above the town of Monroe. And the first, so the task was pretty simple. It was Monroe as the first turn point, and then the next turn point was on the opposite side of that entire mountain range, down here in the Kusharm Valley. So it didn't matter what you did in between, you just had to find a way to get from one turn point, get from Monroe to Cushong. So everybody hiked to Cove. That was the obvious move. And then the day, but we got to Cove pretty early, and so the thermals were not on. So most of us kept hiking. And we kept hiking through some fairly heavy bushwhacking. And then ultimately gained a trail here that continued out here, but then a lot of bushwhacking again to get from this trail here that cut across the side of the mountain up to where you could potentially launch. And I think we all looked at this, and in hindsight, I should have looked at this and said, okay, that looks really brushy. And I should have thought, maybe that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to go up there to launch. And I can tell you that once I got up there, it definitely did not make sense. So by the time I got here, people were we're just starting to launch all the way down off of Cove. And they were making progress. They were starting to climb. So people who hiked to Cove and stopped were already in the air. We were up here literally like pulling sagebrush out of the ground, moving rocks out of the way, and there are like 15 of us, trying to get a place where all 15 of us could get off the hill. I think I was the third or second person off the hill. And the really fast guys like Aaron, they just kept hiking. And by the time I was here, they were already launching off the top, which was totally good. Like plenty of room to launch, not problematic at all. But those of us who are sort of mid-pack, we chose the worst of both worlds. So by the time I finally launched, I uprooted a sagebrush. It was then stuck in my lines. My wing was still flying okay, but I had broken a couple of brake lines, but I still tried to climb out. I knew that if I could just get over the range and down to Kusharm, I could clear everything out and then continue on the task. But I was not able to hook a thermal. I was fighting it and fighting it and fighting it. And I ultimately ended up landing back down at Cove, cleared the sagebrush out, relaunched, scratched around for a minute, but then immediately got out and was able to complete the task. So the short version here is the value of hiking from here all the way up to here was 0. Because I started on Cove, I hiked all the way up, launched, flew down, top landed Cove, and then ultimately ended up launching Cove behind all the people who just stopped hiking at Cove, took some time to eat and drink, and then ultimately launched to continue on the task. So I think the lesson there is just be smart about pacing and timing. I was hiking sort of, I don't know if you look at it as a like on a scale from 1 to 10, I pushed myself sort of at I don't know, an 8 or a 9 to get to Cove as quickly as I could, and then it wasn't on, so then I just kept going. I just kept hiking. And if instead I had been smart and thought about the forecast and when the day was going to turn on and how quickly I needed to hike to Cove, I could have taken a much more leisurely pace, saved a ton of energy for later in the day, and then still been in a perfectly acceptable place to launch, climb out, fly over the mountain range without pushing nearly as hard as I did. And the fact that even though I did do that extra hiking, I ended up top landing Cove anyway, it just sort of reinforced the lesson. So anyway, picking where to launch carefully, thinking about the launches ahead of time that you're going to use, using Google Earth. There's enough resolution in Google Earth in this area that you can get a pretty good sense of what a launch is going to be like, how brushy it will be, or whether it's super rocky, or if there's trees, etc. So taking the time to think about where you're going to launch, think about pacing, all of those things can make a huge difference in how successful you are at completing a task. Any more questions on any of these topics? All right. We've been going for over an hour, so my recommendation is maybe we call it there. I will just say one thing super quick. In terms of the challenge tasks, there's a couple of things that we have tried to do. Well, I guess first of all, for all tasks, I already mentioned this, but we're always trying to force people to make decisions. Do you hike or do you run? Do you fly now or do you wait? Those decisions, I think, are part of what make hike and fly racing so fun, is that you have to make a call and then live with the consequences and try and recover from it in the best way possible if you were wrong, or enjoy how great it is when you get it right. I think that's part of what makes this sport so dynamic and so engaging. So all of the tasks, we really try and force people to make hard decisions throughout the task. The second thing is we always try and make sure that people are sort of encouraged or they benefit, and Gavin referred to this earlier, that they benefit from making moves before the day is really turned on. So despite the fact that there's some really big hikes that we can have people do, you can still easily, not easily, but often you can end up at a reasonable launch before the thermals are really starting to go. And so what we'll often do is put a ground turn point down in the valley after the first hike. It can be a little brutal, but it means that people are the people who hike fast, launch and glide down to that first turn point, then end up with an advantage, as opposed to people who hike, wait for the day to turn on and then start flying. So anyway, those are a couple of principles that apply pretty much to all tasks. And then for challenge tasks specifically, we're trying to keep people out of the deep mountains, because if you're landing deep and you're not familiar with hike and fly competitions generally, there could be potentially a safety issue. We also want these tasks to be very approachable. We don't want people who haven't done a ton of cross-country flying to feel intimidated, and being able to fly sort of along the front of the mountain range as opposed to back deep into the mountain range makes a big difference. And then finally, for people who don't have much cross-country experience, we want to still make sure that the tasks are accomplishable. So the challenge tasks should all be doable by, as long as you're reasonably fit, by hiking up and gliding down. And clearly, if you can hook a few thermals, or even a lot of thermals, and link them together, the task is going to be easier and faster. But we wanted to make it possible, even if you're not comfortable with that. So those are some of the things that we're aiming for with some of the challenge tasks. And I think that's about it.
Ben,
there are a few other things that I was going to go through, but like I said, I think we've burned plenty of time.
one more question about the challenge tasks. I saw something about top landing not being a requirement on the website. Is it like if you can top land, that might help you because you might have more options, or like these tasks are designed so that, you're tagging things that are your ground waypoints don't have mountains on them, if that makes sense.
Yes, exactly. The one exception is sort of the first turn point after the start might be a ground turn point, right? Because you would have to hike to it. But generally speaking, yes, you are correct. We would never put a top landing ground. We would never put a ground turn point that forces the challenge group to top land something.
Gotcha, thanks.
That was great, Ben. I really appreciate it. A lot of great information. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for tuning in, everybody. Hopefully it was helpful.